I was inspired to do this tutorial by episode 123 of the Time for Teachership podcast. We were unit dreaming, a science unit, connecting it to justice. And at the end, our guest Phil was like, I really want to build a base of knowledge of justice-y science connection so that we can really brainstorm with my team and really think about what are these projects and units going to be as we kind of redesign for justice and think about units and content for science in the context of justice. So a couple things I would say here as you're coaching teachers to think through this and departments to think through this. One, have a regular source of kind of incoming information. Listen to either collectively, like each person take a podcast or a news source, or individually just kind of suggest personalized PD. I love things like Code Switch, things like Throughline. STEM for Real is a great education podcast. And we had the host of that podcast, Dr. Bakshi McLean, on our Time for Teachership podcast as well. But all of these kind of connect science and justice. Another option I would do is look at rethinking schools for existing curriculum, and I would also use Google. So I'm going to take you on a tutorial of how I would do those last two in this video. Here we go. Schools.org is excellent. I would search for science or whatever your specific science is in the search bar, and you can kind of scroll down. You could also just look at the magazines, current issues, the archives. You could look at any of these things, but kind of skimming through, I think it might be interesting to look at, okay, for example, if I was teaching biology, Henrietta Lacks, science, race, and media. Oh, interesting. So this could be really interesting to unpack. I know Phil was teaching a thermal chemistry unit, so this could connect to that. Carbon cycles, okay, so that could potentially connect as well. This is some work with Dr. Chris Emden, excuse me. Let's see, what else? Yeah, I mean, so there's some interesting things here that could be community air quality. So, okay, so let me just click this and see what this is. So this gives us a little bit of a preview. It talks about exactly what they were doing. Okay, we might not have full access here to the article itself. You should become a subscriber. But if you are just kind of getting ideas here, I do think this initial search is going to be great. I next would actually go to Google and I would think about, okay, so let's see, thermochemistry, so we saw carbon cycle. You know what? Let's actually do water cycle is something he specifically talked about. And let's just type for water cycle and racism. Let's see what's going on here. All right, so maybe this is specifically about California. There's just something from the Legal Defense Fund here. I'm going to just right-click this. Environmental racism. Okay, so that's really interesting. I might look at World Economic Forum, so I might take a global perspective here. That could be super interesting. And again, this is just giving us some initial ideas. So this is something I would talk to your team about and think about how do we coach around the process of searching. So it's not necessarily about what we're doing here and clicking all these buttons is right or wrong, but how do we keep in mind the questions we're asking as we're engaging in this? So the World Economic Forum, I like because it's a global perspective. Okay, so now it's talking about, so here's examples from Flint, Michigan. Here's an example in China. What is environmental racism? Okay, so it gives me a little bit of a definition. It talks about the civil rights leader that coined the term. And then it looks like there's more suggestions here. So I might actually use this as kind of a deep dive. There's some graphs. Excellent. I want to be able to pull some of this and use as text in my unit. So again, this is just kind of getting us thinking. When we look at this, there's some, again, images. There are a lot more studies and links that are kind of in here, reports. Okay, excellent. So I think this is what I would do. Again, so you can start with Google and then click in and then follow the links, right? Follow what would be interesting to your students, bring students into the conversation, kind of curate a couple things that you could bring back to them. And again, rethinking schools is another really good one to be able to skim, get the headlines and just kind of put out there to students is what might be interesting to you. Would you want to do an investigation of community air quality? How would we, in a physics class, how would we look at racism and privilege more broadly? Think about, are you trying to use a broad kind of entry into justice and science, or are you very specifically looking at community air quality, for example? Are you looking at a specific thing? And if so, are we doing that hyper locally? Are we doing that globally? Are we going to do a comparison? And are we going to have students investigate? Do we want students to actually collect the data themselves or not, right? So these are kind of all questions that I would ask and guide teachers to ask in this process. So that's what I would do. Coach through the process, coach the questions to be asking, and just start with Google or a couple other reliable sources, and then go from there, asking the questions and filtering through what would be most relevant to students and what do you need to do within the unit as you go through that process of exploring those inputs and those sparks. And also, if something isn't relevant for the unit you're working on right now, make a process, a Google Doc that's shared with the team or something that you can actually just write in a couple resources or ideas in and come back to the next time you're working on a new unit that it might be relevant for.